right, thank you very much, everyone. I am Peter Bates. I'm from the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, and we've been pleased to be a part of this project for, well, I think since it started a number of years. At OSSTF, we do have a keen interest in the impact of violence on our members and the resultant mental health issues affecting members and the implications of that on recruitment, retention of future members, as well as what happens to the students when there's numerous ed workers absent on any given day from school. So with that, I will just introduce our first speaker, and that will be Susan Rodger, a psychologist and associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Western University, a principal investigator at the Center for School-Based Mental Health, and a member of the Gender, Trauma, and Violence Knowledge Incubator at Western. I will pass it over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, Peter. I'll share my screen here. There we go, if everybody can see that. I'm pleased to be here, and I want to extend my thanks to our partners, OSSTF, represented here by you, Peter, and the Canadian Teachers Federation, and to our leaders of this great big project, Ivy and the leadership team. It's been quite a enriching and rewarding experience, and I've gotten to work with Kristen and Melissa, and it's been wonderful. So I'm here to just give you a broad overview. Much of what you'll see in the beginning is available in our report. I think it's always important to stress that there is a connection between who we are as people and who we are as professionals. And I'm just in such admiration of our accounting team for the way they shared those connections, their own lived experience. Because it's really important to understand context, right? Because when we discuss prevalence of things like mental illness or mental unwellness, we have to remember that teachers are people who, like many people, bear tremendous responsibilities in their lives outside of work, and particularly in a female-dominated profession like teaching, that these workers bear tremendous responsibility for outcomes with very little agency, very little control, and that's a great recipe for stress. As has been reported, we had lots of teachers respond to the survey, and lots of education workers as well. So this particular presentation focuses on the pre-K to 12 teachers, of whom there were 733 who completed the survey. You can see here that a very small number of them identified as racialized, Indigenous, or living with a disability. And their voices are very important, and I know that comes up in the interview work as well. A larger proportion of our respondents were from the elementary panel as compared to the secondary. That's important because of the differences between those two panels and the work conditions and the ways in which the pressures apply. 95% working directly in the classroom, so we know that we've got people here who are doing the day in and day out work, and people who are what we would classify as mid-career. Excuse me, they've been teaching for an average of 16 years with a standard deviation of 9 years. So really going from 17 years up to 25. And with that, all that experience comes the knowledge that the average age was 42 years with a standard deviation of 10. And that most live with a partner or spouse. Many live with dependent children, and the average number of children for those who had kids was 2 with a standard deviation of 1. So busy households. When talking about their health, their wellness, they shared that their health was slightly worse than before COVID, and that they found their work emotionally demanding, 5 being the highest you could go on that, and a significant difference between the elementary and secondary school students. I think it's important in terms of context to realize that with all of these, 43% having dependent children and their average age being 42, the Canadian average for having your first child is 31 and a half years old now. So the likelihood that these are younger children is certainly there. And the likelihood that elementary teachers are feeling their work to be more emotionally demanding may be connected with the fact that there are far more female teachers in the elementary panel working with younger students, and they're with them all day. There's no rotary or very little rotary in the elementary panel. So, again, we've reported this before for all the teachers and education workers, but to say here that when we look at people, how they spend their time outside of school hours, we talk about, teachers in this example having work-life balance. And here we're seeing that many of them are working at least an hour a week after school, but I think about 50% of them are working more than 4 hours a week after school, between 4 and 10. And when we look at volunteer work, there are 40% of them who are working between 1 and 6 hours of volunteer work every week. So that adds up to 10 hours a week. And if people are doing both of those, that is a significant draw on your free time. Whether you're doing that for a couple hours every weekday evening or taking an entire day on the weekend. So we don't have a lot of free time for all that other work-life balance stuff. And just to say, over half of the teachers who responded to these questions indicated that they are doing volunteer work, and they all indicated they're doing after school work. When we look at the sources of non-work stress during COVID, which, we asked the teachers what it was like for them in the moment when they were responding. And so the green line is secondary panel teachers, the orange line is elementary panel, and the blue line is the combination of the two. So you can see by the length of the blue lines that time pressure was significantly more of a non-work stress. So fitting in all of those home responsibilities outside of work responsibilities, followed up by caring for their emotional health, caring for their children, caring for their physical health, and then marital stress. I think we all know stories and perhaps have personal experience of how tough it was during COVID, how hard it was on families, and particularly families who are isolated without a lot of support. So we can see some differences between elementary and secondary panels. And when we think about, why these pressures or these significant differences might exist between the two panels, we can hypothesize things like the isolating nature of the secondary panel, where people are teaching different groups of students multiple times a day. But that's just conjecture. So looking at their work stress during COVID, we can see that work overload is the biggest line there. And again, the blue is both elementary and secondary panels together. It's important, I think, to note that work overload was done by, and a great amount of that work overload was done at home when they were teaching online, and not having a boundary between what was home life and what was work life. And you can see that the digital stress was all it was there as well. I'm not privy to what it was like in terms of assisting teachers with the technical parts of online teaching. I can tell you at my university, help was offered, but there were very few people in our IT department and our instructional design department who could actually help you in a timely way. And that was quite stressful. So I am only imagining that it was the same for teachers, and maybe we'll hear about that from Shauna. I note the challenges with poor relationships with management, with parents and with students here. So before I talk too much about the results of what predicted mental health distress, and you can see here that orange line is people who were severely distressed, and the blue line is people who were moderately distressed. I just want to talk about the K6 measure that we use to measure mental health distress. So this measure has been widely used for decades. And it asks 6 basic questions about your mental health. And the authors of that, and one was Kessler, and that's why it's called K6. Kessler, in his original research, identified the cutoff score as 13. So if you got a score of 13 or above on this measure, you would be in the classification of severely distressed, and you needed psychological treatment urgently. And over the years, people have worked on this. What's the difference between having a score of 12 and a score of 13? And the recent research is telling us that a cutoff score of 10 is probably more realistic, that the ways in which we are impacted by poor mental health when you report a score of 10 put you in this category of moderately distressed, which also indicates that you are in need of psychological support. And we know from decades of studying mental health that those who are moderately distressed will, with the changing conditions or the addition of more stress, will become severely distressed. So when we did this analysis, I asked Christine to use the 2 cutoff scores, so that cutoff score of 10 being the blue one and the cutoff score of 13 being the orange one, because we don't want to withhold any kind of support or intervention from people who don't hit that severe mark, right? We want to help people where they're at, and hopefully before they get to that point of being severely distressed. So you can see here that these are odds ratios. So anything above or below 1 means that it's important. And I've just put up the significant ones here. So you can see that in the amongst the severely distressed folk, developing and implementing an IEP was quite a stressful event, and especially doing these when they were teaching online or not being in person with their students would have been an extra burden. Work expectations for extracurriculars were not so much of a burden for the people who were severely distressed, although that was not a significant difference there, they're both significant. The emotionally demanding work, as people are moderately distressed, they're more aware of that mental health stress that they're feeling. I would imagine that this would fall in with the other research that tells us you get to a certain point and you can't really identify how stressed or how impaired you are. The ability to cope with work demands, we see how low that is. So people not feeling like they can meet the non-work demands. So with their family, for example, their personal lives. And we see that the non-work stressors, so the things we talked about earlier, the family, your own emotional health, being very important in terms of predicting the level of mental health distress, as was the overall health and the gender. And doing a gender analysis, we do know that the distribution was quite different for women versus men. Of course, as we've already discussed, women are more likely to report it than men. But we have to be careful because there was such a low number of men compared to women. We'll talk about that in a minute. That difference actually mirrors what happens in the province of Ontario. But this solution was significant and explained about 29. We had about 29% success rate in putting people into these categories using this analysis. Interesting that the non-significant predictors were which teaching panel you were in, the lack of prep time, the large class sizes, and the class composition. So those didn't reach the level of being really difficult. So why did we do the logistic regression? Well, I always look to the end of what we're doing, and here it's very clear that what we're hoping to do at the end is to create supports, interventions, education programs that will help improve the mental health of people who are struggling. So if we can understand how to predict who might be struggling, it helps us apply our resources in a most effective way. I think it's important to realize here that of all of our 733 people who participated in this study, 525 of them were at a level of 10 or above in terms of their mental health distress. So 50% of men and 76% of women hit that cutoff score of 10. And I think that's incredibly important to understand in terms of who's in the classroom or how they're doing. So how can this inform next steps? Well, certainly, looking at these kinds of responses would be great. And I think when we look theoretically at self-determination theory, at job determination theory, and trauma and violence informed theories, we understand that we have to take context into account. People need to be part of the collaboration, the solution development, and they have to feel safe and connected. And through these ways, we can hopefully improve the mental health of these most important workers. That's it for me.
All right, thank you, Susan, for that piece. And I will just remind people, I think we're going to save questions and chat for the end, and we will right now go next to Kristen Ferguson, a professor of education at the Charlotte School of Education and the Dr. Elizabeth Thorne Chair in Literacy at Nipissing University. Her research interests include literacy education, teacher professional development, and teacher mental health, stress, and coping. Kristen's talk today is School Violence, Experiences Impact on Canadian Education Workers. Thank you, Kristen.
Great, thank you. Just trying to figure out my sharing here. Not sure what you can see. Are we good? Oh,
That's great. Thank you.
okay. So I just, as the teaching lead, I just wanted to spend just a minute just talking about the partnership and to thank everybody. At the beginning, the SSHRC funders talked about our knowledge mobilization, and it could not have been possible without our constant encouragement and cheerleaders from CTF and OSSTF. And whether it was webinars, asking to speak to your members, research committees, podcasts, our partner groups were just incredible to work with in that regard. So thank you. And a thank you also to Sarah Simkin for your work on the survey. I know you've already been thanked today. Christine Tulk for your survey analysis, Melissa Carente, who did the heavy lifting for the interviews, and of course, our discussant today, Shauna Mitchell, our boots on the ground, and we're so thrilled to have you here talking to us. So I will be as succinct as possible. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about school violence and the impacts and experiences from Canadian education workers. So unlike Susan's presentation, I'm also going to include all education workers. So this also includes educational assistants, ECEs, and other education staff and their experiences. Okay, so violence in schools is a significant issue. As you can see from the graphic, 95% of the violence in schools is actually student on worker violence. And this is very concerning. And a lot of the previous literature from the past 20 years has often been student on student violence, but now we're seeing how education workers are now the victims of school violence. And we see 8.5% experience violence daily or weekly, which is an extremely concerning and high number, but also at the same time congruent with much other research from other jurisdictions. And we did some interesting statistical work with this, and thank you to Christine. Which groups were more likely to experience violence? We did find that educational assistants, paraprofessionals, as they're referred to in the literature, are more likely to experience violence than other education workers. This doesn't surprise those of us in this field. It's what we anticipated we would find, as educational assistants work with some of the most challenging students in the building. Elementary workers are more likely to experience violence than their secondary counterparts. There's many possible reasons for this. One of the reasons is perhaps that we've hypothesized is that some of the supports are not yet in place for these younger students, as their IEPs are still developing, and there's a challenge with getting funding in terms of educational assistance supports and education plans in place. There is a clear link between mental health and school violence. Those education workers who experience violence were nearly twice as likely to report having a mental health issue over the course of their careers. And we're seeing kind of a disturbing trend that, violence is kind of a normalized thing now, as it's part of the job. However, we know that the psychological impacts of violence do indeed last longer than the physical violence and those physical wounds. It's a significant problem. So we just pulled some interesting quotes here that we thought were pertinent from our interviews. And some of them are very disturbing, some of these personal stories about one teacher, he would punch me and kick me. Another student would bite me, spit me in the face, kick me in the shins. And the other student would throw objects at me, stapling my teaching partner's hands, slamming doors, punched, kicked, spitting, and even name calling. And the impacts of this are really strong. I mean, one teacher told me flat out, something just broke inside me and I was done. And then, the teachers and educational workers' working conditions are students' learning conditions. So this quote really sums that up. We can't model for students how to access and use feelings or emotions because we have been taught to ignore them ourselves. And we do acknowledge them and find space for them. Then we won't be able to model that for anybody else. So that idea of emotional labor and hiding your own emotions, even though maybe a student has just thrown a chair across the room, you evacuate, you have to go back and pretend like it's all good and everything's okay because you're the strong adult in the classroom modeling for those for those students. It's a very difficult job. So where does this leave us for teaching? We wanted to find out, did experiencing violence predict leaving the profession and organization? And indeed it does. That's not to say there aren't other factors that cause that. There are, but we do know that our statistics and our findings showed that having a mental health issue and experiencing violence predicts both of those things. So leaving the organization, which would be generally a school board, and leaving the profession entirely. And this is over and above gender role and panel. So I just pasted some interesting headlines that we see, you know, these are just from the last month or so from some newspapers. And the top one is from our partner group's research, how underfunding is the leading factor of violence in the Ontario classrooms, and which is leading us to teacher shortages. It's, you know, finding a substitute is very difficult. My colleague Melissa Carente always likes to tell the story that this go-to supply teacher for her children's school is the bus driver, as he's there every day and he shows up, and does he have a job that day? An unqualified teacher. So these are very concerning for us. It's having direct impact on teaching, quality of teaching, and our education system. And just finally, what does this mean? Well, everything from looking after those teachers who do have these extreme experiences in the classroom, but they're extreme, but they're common. And a lot of people don't realize what's happening. Funding is a big one, which I know my partner groups have been really emphasizing about how underfunding is it's a huge cause of some of this problem, whether it be class size to educational supports. It's very multidimensional. Balanced workload and meeting with special needs, I'll just combine for a minute in saying that our colleagues from the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation have really been done a fabulous job kind of bringing the light to the issue of this issue of classroom composition. So who are in our classrooms and what are their needs, and is that equitably distributed? And finally, principal and administrative support is a big one, and it comes time and time again. Supportive principals can make or break how a teacher experiences violence, and if even after experiencing a violent act, having that administrative support can definitely mitigate some of the negative impacts of experiencing violence in the classroom. So I'll end it there, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you
Good
very much for
afternoon.
that, Kristen.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Peter.
Oh, I was just going to try and introduce you, Shauna. Shauna
You go right
Mitchell,
ahead.
OSSTF member and secondary school teacher in North Bay, Ontario. Shauna has been a member of the Worker Advisory Group for HPW, lending her professional experience as an educator throughout the project. So we welcome Shauna's thoughts and personal reflections on these important findings about teacher mental health in Canadian schools. Take it away.
Okay, well, I just want to say thank you for having me, and it's been a pleasure working on this project, and a very strong learning experience for myself as a professional as well. So lots of great points that were brought up by both our speakers, and I mean, I suppose I'm here to you know, I could add some examples to highlight what they're saying. In our pre-meeting, they also were clear in saying that if there was something I disagreed with, that I could speak up, but quite frankly, there isn't. I have plenty of examples to highlight, but some of the points that I would like to touch on, for example, is the piece about the IEPs and teachers implementing the IEPs. Doesn't matter really what grade level you're at. If the supports are not there to implement the IEP, it becomes very challenging in the classroom. And it is extremely common for out of, let's say, 25 to 30 students in your class, that at least half have IEPs that you have to be working on implementing some accommodations or modifications at the elementary level, which can be a lot more significant than at the secondary level. As for the secondary level, so part of my role the last 3 years has been to be a resource teacher for our virtual school. And one of the biggest questions and challenges that we've had is how to implement IEP accommodations via online learning. So when COVID hit and we were all transferred online, it was a big shock for everyone. No one was really expecting that, so fair enough. However, nothing has come out as to how we provide accommodations to students who are doing the asynchronous learning. So the last 3 years, our virtual school has had an option of synchronous versus asynchronous. And when you're doing synchronous learning for teachers, it's a little bit easier to provide some accommodations. But when you're doing the full asynchronous learning, there has been no direction on how we help these students that have accommodations. And I've asked the question numerous times and I still have not been answered. So that in itself is challenging, because as teachers, we care, and that's why we're here and we want to help these students. We just really don't know how to do that yet, or have no direction. Oh my gosh, there's so much. I had written down a bunch of notes before we started, but then there's so many more that I took during the presentations. I think lack of support from administration is a big one as well. But at the same time, if we take a step back, they're people too. And I think they also feel the same, a lack of support. And that is a trickle down effect to us. When they don't know how to support us because they've asked for support that also is not coming. So I think it's, a bigger symptom of larger conversations that have to happen, solution-based conversations. And something else that is really interesting to me as we talk about this is the lack of staff. So for example, we have a program at one of our schools, contained special education classroom. And all year the EAs, there's supposed to be 2 EAs in that room. They are the bus driver, oddly enough, and a parent, which I'm sure they are lovely people, but in terms of being qualified people to look after students with significant special needs, that's challenging. And we are opening a 3rd class as well in one of our schools, and there are no EAs to staff it. And even just looking, and of course, I'm speaking strictly from my school board's perspective, but the job postings that are up over and over and over that go unfilled, I think is a very strong statement in itself. And I would like to point out that's at all levels. That's ECE, EA, teachers, school administrators, and the superintendent level as well. There's been job pool postings for superintendent and vice principal for almost 2 years now, ongoing postings. And so I think it's affecting everyone. Another thing that I wanted to just point out was, I believe the nursing group brought this up as well, is workspace. So I know in my school, personally, we are in the process of losing almost all of our workspaces that are going to be turned into kind of a transient sort of thing, where on your prep, you bring your work in, you sit down on a desk, and then you go back to your class, wherever your next class is. And a big part of teaching, when we have these incidences of violence where you need to decompress and you need to talk to a trusted colleague, whether it be a mentor or you are the mentor to someone else, or even if it's just to vent for 5 minutes to get that off your chest so that you're not carrying it with you, we are going to lose all of that as of next year at my particular school. So again, I can't speak to what's happening at other schools, but I know that has drastically increased the stress level just in the past couple months at my school alone. So we're not really sure what's going to happen with that, but a lot of people are very worried about losing that supportive, trusted colleague piece, which I think has been brought up in almost every presentation. So I found that interesting as sort of a thread to go throughout. Something else that I heard in one of the other presentations that I thought was interesting for teaching as well is, I don't believe there are many of my colleagues who do access the EAP supports in terms of counseling. It was just this year, through a personal situation, that I realized we could get free legal advice. I had no idea. So I think part of it is the advertising of what these services really offer. And again, it's the time as well. I do access those services myself, but it's a lot of my personal time. And when you look at the graphics that show how teachers use their personal time, there's not a lot left for yourself to access those services. And just one final point, just to touch on sort of attrition and teachers leaving the field. I've been fortunate enough the last couple of years to be an instructor alongside Kristen at the Schulich School of Education. And even from a couple of years ago until now, one of the biggest questions I have from my students is, what else can we do with this? Do we have to go into a classroom? So I've had to start adding into discussion points, what other jobs, what other sectors hire teachers, and what does that job look like versus the classroom? And how can I help prepare you for that other than just going to the classroom? So lots more points that I could touch on, but those were some main ones that seemed really, really important from our presenters. So thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. I think that leaves us with about 10 minutes for questions or chat and discussion, and who wants to take that on?
It'd be great to hear if Susan, Kristen, you have any sort of feedback for what Shauna presented. Peter, also, if you have any comments or questions, from your perspective, that would be really wonderful to hear and to share.
I think I'd like to pick up on what you said about the principals and their people, and that is so true. And the idea of the manager and what is the manager, how does, they have their own feelings, but they really are in a middle kind of situation. And I know we're going to probably talk about that with the leadership team and the cross-cutting. And it's something I spoke to with the higher education group yesterday. It's really true. And wasn't a part of our study, although we did have some administrators complete our survey, but there is other research happening in Ontario about principal mental health. And it really is an understudied area. So I think that's great for us to keep in mind. I think it's easy for us because our administrators are the people that we see every day. And, we think maybe it ends there, but we know it doesn't, right? There's a lot more of the structural piece going on. And like you say, what can they do? Like, where does it all come down to, we do need more funding structurally. We need more supports and how will those be implemented in a way that's feasible?
I'm sure I could talk for hours with my union hat on. The things I've seen in Ontario this year, from someone being an acting vice principal after March break, from a teacher of the classroom to principal 6 weeks later, because they just can't fill any jobs in so many parts of the province, and empty EA spots for the entire year. And especially in the north, where there's the Jordan's principal and each student can have their own EA, but they can't fill the position. So then they start doubling up, and EAs are working with 2 or 3 vulnerable and sometimes violent students. So the students are at risk, the members are at risk, especially the ones that aren't trained at all. They're 18 years old out of high school and you're in EA. So you've had no boundaries training or no training whatsoever on how to support these students. So it's putting students and workers at risk for mental and physical health.
And I think that one of the possible outcomes is that when you put, Bachelor of Education candidates in the classroom as paid work to fill some of these vacancies, which is what's happening now. People are getting, temporary teaching certificates. I really worry that that is going to result in them definitely not going into the classroom, because they're still doing their own work, at the learner level. Many of them half of my students have part-time jobs to help pay the cost of higher education. I don't think that we're sending out the healthiest teacher candidates into these high stress environments. So I do worry about what that's going to mean in terms of their ability to withstand some of the pressures and stay in the work.
And if I could just add on the point about pressures, it's interesting when we talk about work-life balance, because, we constantly use our own personal cell phones for communication, constantly, whether it be between, a teacher or teacher and admin, or, and it's this constant message from admin, well, just text me, just text me, just text me. And half part of the problem is they don't have actual Wi-Fi service in the main office here. So that's an interesting challenge. However, you know, for the teachers that don't have cell phones, or the teachers that just don't want to use their personal cell phones and shouldn't have to. And, you know, a lot of teachers are to the point where I personally do not cross this boundary, but they will text with parents at night. Or I have had to cross that boundary teaching co-op for 10 years, texting my students, because that was the only way to really get a hold of them when they're on the workplace, you know, the work site and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, for that to just be expected now, and, you know, not being provided cell phones, but then on the other hand, you know, we will get messages, work-life balance, don't work past your hours, but then it's all this other expected stuff that we don't have time to do during the day, so we have to do it at night. So there's some interesting mixed messages that I think are very much leading to some mental health concerns as well.
Definitely. And to pick up on the EAP point you brought up in your discussion, and I'm glad you brought it up, is that so many people, teachers we interviewed, they are very hesitant to use any kind of support service offered by the board, because they feel like they're going to find out, right? And they're so much more willing to use support services offered by the Federation. And maybe it's just a messaging thing, right? I mean, whether the EAP is through the board or through the union, it makes a big difference to education workers, where the support is coming from, because there is a sincere distrust from the board. And it makes sense when we're talking a lot about teacher attrition and, you know, absences, and the idea of these attendance policies and these management programs. You know, teachers get 10, 11 days paid a year for illness, but if you use 4 or 5, then you're going to be tracked, and then you're going to get called into HR. And those were reoccurring themes that came up over and over again, is that the board is watching and they are not on our side. So it is, you know, it is a huge part of who's offering the resources and what are we offering.
I think you're absolutely right on, Shauna and Kristen, with all of the difficulties with that. And I think it's an example of one thing that makes it harder, but from a research perspective, probably doesn't rise up to the top, right, of the heap. Stress is one of those things where it's always multidimensional. It always comes from various sources. And if one of those sources of stress is you don't trust your employer, that means you're not going to use and that can mean you're not going to use the services they provide. And that means that you're not going to get the help you need, right? It all hangs in there together. Yeah.
And for those I'm not aware, there's a standardized form if you're going on a medical leave or have any kind of modifications or accommodations to your job for everyone in Ontario working in education. And I do notice a difference in how the boards generally respond to whether if it's physical restrictions or mental restrictions. So there's still some work to be done on that front.
Just an interesting note on that personally. I had my own educational assessment done back in October, and I have come out with some pretty distinct learning disabilities where if I had accommodations in my job, I could be better and I could meet my potential a little bit more. And you know, it's just a very personal example, and I hope this does not happen to anyone else, because I would hate for that to be the norm. However, when I submitted that back in the fall, I have yet to hear back from anyone. And repeated emails to the HR, like the main person for teachers and the manager, have not heard a single thing back. And 2 messages I've received from principals just in casual discussions about this is, well, you're on your own. No one is going to provide any accommodations for you because it's not physical or it's not a back to work. And someone else said, because I require extra processing time for a lot of auditory things. And so I asked about job interviews, and they said, well, I would want the same accommodations as you. So, you know, that would be good for everyone. So you're not going to get them. So that kind of messaging is challenging to receive as well. But like I said, I hope I am not the norm in that, and I will continue to work on that. But that has happened to at least one person.
Yes, work accommodations is actually another paper that Christine and I took the lead on to submit, and a number of teachers, I think it was between 15 and 20% do not receive the work accommodations they've requested in terms of mental health issues. So that's a very significant number as well. When we think about duty to accommodate and advocacy, there's a lot of moving parts there, and it's definitely.
Yeah, I kind of forgot about that personal example until one of the academia presenters brought that up in terms of how do you accommodate, right? So I understand it's not necessarily an, obvious accommodations, but with a discussion, which I would hope would be done with anyone who needs accommodations, could probably be a simple solution.
All right, and I hate to wrap up this conversation, but we're at our time, and I'm sure we can all do some more work on this front, and I look forward to that. Thank you.